Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you for inviting me here. I'll try and keep my voice over the microphone. Excuse me about my voice. It's a little bit croaky. I'm perfectly well. I just indulged in my passion for Chelsea Football Club on Wednesday night. Been working with Karen for many years about research and NLP, so what I'm going to talk about is research and NLP in the context of developing NLP as a professional practice. Note that I've tweaked the title of this to research and NLP. It's not necessarily research into NLP, it's about a relationship for me. And this image here comes from a metaphor actually that I think Karen came up with about a year and a half ago about the idea of stepping stones, the idea of creating bridges and pathways between worlds. Because I'll argue to some extent research and NLP have operated as separate worlds. And I seem to spend some of my time going between these worlds, talking about NLP to academic communities, and also talking about research to NLP communities. And there are lots of people here, though, who move between those worlds, and I think part of the purpose here is to encourage more movement and more exchange between these worlds. So, a little bit about my background and how I've been involved in NLP, because most of you don't know me from Adam, so I'm a senior lecturer at Surrey Business School, University of Surrey. My background is in organisational change and in management learning and development. And my interests in NLP date back to the 1980s, that's when I first heard about it. And particularly, I've had from then and ever since, a real passion for Gregory Bateson's work. Informed my work then, I'm still writing about it, still trying to understand some of what he was talking about, but to me that Bateson's ideas are really at the heart of NLP. I attended my first NLP training course in the late 1980s and trained through to master practitioner. In the 1990s, running a master's at Surrey for people doing coaching and consultancy work, I taught NLP on that MSc as a mode of one-to-one work. So along with many other people in the community, we've been taking NLP into universities. In the mid-1990s, my first PhD student to complete successfully, a guy called Mike Kearsley, who works in business consultancy, the first PhD I've supervised that actually involved NLP within it, particularly using ideas of meta-programs to look at sales preferences amongst consultants. I started writing about NLP in academic journal articles. The first one was published in 2003, based on the idea that Bateson and NLP were ideas that inform my practice. There's relatively little written about NLP in academic journals, and it seemed a good opportunity. Well, it's proved a good opportunity, and it's sometimes a rocky road, because, as you may be aware, academic communities have certain attitudes towards NLP, which often come out of those. But generally, my experience is that when researchers have the time to think about and consider and understand what NLP is about, they're positive towards it. 2008, just 4 years ago, our first international NLP research conference that ANLP now runs, held at the University of Surrey. That was a pretty groundbreaking event. Brought people from all over the world, including Frank Bork from the States, who unfortunately can't be with us today, Dr. Susie Linda Peltz from Australia. Really a very enjoyable and very successful event. Oh, and then here's my plug. 2009, with my co-author Jane Matheson, we wrote our book, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, A Critical Appreciation for Managers and Developers. I haven't even checked if it's on sale here. It's horrendously expensive, sorry about that. What Jane and I were attempting to do in this book, though, is to say, what are the main criticisms of NLP? What are some of the substance or not behind that? What are some of the arguments that we brought to bear about NLP and its validity? I haven't started writing another book yet. There's a lot of it there. Okay, so Karen's underlined the importance of professionalism in NLP. So what I want to do now is apply some NLP thinking to this issue, particularly to the relationship between research and NLP. So I think many people here will recognise modelling as one of the most important processes in NLP. So if NLP wants to be professional, what might we find in relation to research if we were to model professions? Well, I think some of the things we find are that professions tend to take research as part of their ethical responsibility, part of their responsibility to seek the best results for their clients. They continually develop and evaluate their knowledge base. Professions do not want their knowledge base to get out of date and be overtaken by other professions. And professions maintain and develop active links with research communities, including but not confined to universities. So, one of the key points I want to make to you today is that research activity contributes towards credibility, recognition, and respectability of professions. It's research activity rather than having proof that your way of working works. The good news for this, from this is that NLP can become more professional by being research active. It's a little bit of acting as if. So if there isn't proof around that NLP works necessarily, or there's debate about that, actually, from my point of view, what I think is important and what benefits NLP is being active in research. Now, nobody here has to engage in research if you don't want to, okay? It's entirely up to you, but it depends on your outcome. So I suggest that if as an NLP community, NLP people want to become more respected, recognised and credible amongst researchers, academics and others, then I think something that's vital, something that NLP cannot afford not to do, is engage in research. Now, NLP has been around for a long time. So why are we standing here in 2012 talking about needing to develop professionalism and needing to develop research? Well, if we think about what stopped us doing this before, one thing I point to is some relatively anti-research attitudes within the NLP field. A bit of an away meta-program from the idea of research, and perhaps with a bit of a stereotype that researchers all wear white coats and they want to get things into laboratories and tie them down and kill them off and experiment on them. I imagine many of you here today are actually very well informed about research and have had involvement in research and know that there are many varieties. If any of you need, though, or wish to have, maintain this view of research, I can be your ogre today. I haven't brought a white coat. I haven't done an experiment in a lab since I was doing physics at school, but I'll be your ogre if you want. But I think some consequences of this, that NLP has seldom engaged in formal research. There are other modes of working that will commission research and develop partnerships with universities. And I know things like that are happening. Lisa will tell you about the NLP Research and Recognition Project later. But there's been relatively little of this going on in NLP. NLP is also based on some outdated knowledge, particularly as perceived by academics. If you talk about, well, the core of NLP is the meta model, and the meta model is based on Chomsky's work, you might get a scoffing research from some academics who perceive that as very outdated. Ironically, there's a lot of very new research in cognitive neuroscience as one example of an area that I think is actually producing exciting findings that do support some of our ideas and practices in NLP. So if you've ever heard about mirror neurons, work in that area, that's one example of up-to-date knowledge that I think tallies well with NLP. But perceived from the outside, NLP as a field needs to update its knowledge base. And the third thing I'm pointing out here is that generally NLP is perceived as lacking an established evidence base and relying too much on claims that it works. Well, okay, that may be a perfectly valid way of talking to potential clients and being persuasive, but it's not going to persuade. It's not going to persuade research communities about the validity of NLP. It's not surprising in this respect that NLP can be regarded poorly by some academics. I was literally on a discussion group a couple of weeks ago where a senior professor in the field of management referred to NLP as snake oil, which I was delighted to see because everyone talks about, oh, you know, this snake oil thing, and I never heard anyone use the term, but I've got a real example now, which is great. But is this all a missed opportunity as well? There's a very respected professor of coaching based in Australia, Professor Anthony Grant, who says if it weren't for the anti-science sentiment shown by founders of NLP, today we could have seen the original NLP making a useful contribution to the applied psychology curriculum taught at universities. So that there are plenty of academics who recognise the potential value in NLP, but this has not really been recognised and built upon. One of the things that drew me to NLP is this exciting idea that you don't necessarily try and solve a problem straight away. You understand how it's maintained and treat it as an achievement. So if we were to apply some NLP thinking to this idea and this anti-research idea that may be out in the field, what has to happen to maintain that situation? And what happens if we apply our NLP thinking to beliefs about research, maybe beliefs that NLP and research are incompatible? Well, I think we need at least, it needs at least to be nominalizing research. We'd at least need to be using modal operators. We'd at least need to be using universal quantifiers. And we'd at least need to be ignoring positive intention. I'll go through each one of these in a little more detail. So, research, a nominalization, okay? Research, as it happens, a process. So what's the process? Well, don't have time to go today deeply into definitions, and you can find many definitions. But here's one from a good colleague of mine, Professor Mark Saunders. The systematic collection and interpretation of information with a clear purpose to find things out. Of course, this relies on further nominalizations, but it starts to convey the idea of research as a process. And there's nothing in this definition that confines research to laboratories. So let's question that nominalization. Modal operators, a phrase I've heard sometimes, you can't research NLP. Well, we use the meta model. What's one of the questions we might ask in response to that? What would happen if you could? And in fact, I'd argue that it's not about whether or not you can research NLP, it's about in how many ways and with what variety of purposes. And a concern that we've heard is that if you do research in NLP, research might show findings that contradict NLP and show that it doesn't work. Well, if that happens, what happens to our presupposition that there's no failure, only feedback? The whole principle of research is that findings tell you something about what you're studying. And if your findings tell you that what you're studying isn't work, that's useful feedback. Okay. Universal quantifiers. If all research is the same, it's easier maybe to label it. But all research is not the same. Again, I'm sure many of you know this. But there are many varieties of beliefs, for example, about reality and knowledge in the research field. So some researchers, yes, believe that reality is single and tangible and fragmentable, and you can break it down and study it. But many other researchers believe that realities are multiple and constructed and holistic, perfectly at home with the idea that we all have our own maps of the world, that the way we operate in the world is very much driven by and dependent on those maps of the world, and that they can change. If you think there are controversies in NLP sometimes, by the way, you should witness some academics arguing about these versions of reality. I sometimes describe them as paradigm wars. It's very lively. Okay, there are many methods, whole varieties of methods in research. And particularly, there are whole varieties of outcomes. Research isn't just about trying to prove things. Research can be about describing. It can be about understanding and gaining insight. It can be about evaluating, and it can be about developing applications. And this idea of proof itself is a bit of an illusion. There's very little research that ever proves anything. If you know about that variety of research, you'll know that what it can show is whether something is demonstrated to a degree of probability. There are very few single studies that will ever demonstrate anything to everyone's satisfaction. So proof, evidence, comes from building up studies that corroborate results. By the way, I'm not bashing research that sets out to provide that evidence either. It's extremely important, particularly in fields that are reliant on evidence as giving permission to practice. So it's a hugely important part of the whole spectrum of research. It is not the whole of research. If you're interested in finding out more about what I'm referring to as submodalities of research, distinctions within the field, one way you can do that is join NLP and get the next issue of Rapport, where there will be a short introductory article written by my colleague Professor Saunders and myself, based on this map of that particular territory, which Mark calls the research onion. So if you want to explore the detail of that, get Rapport this winter. There's masses of interesting distinctions on that. Positive intention. So if we're going to maintain the idea that research and NLP are somehow antithetical, I think we also may need to ignore positive intention. Because if we chunk up the intentions of NLP and research, we find, for example, I nicked this from Karen Strada's speech, so is it the first time you've been referenced on that? That's like okay. So Karen talks about NLP being about making a difference to society. the premier research funder, government-funded research funding body in this country, in my field, is called the Economic and Social Research Council. Their purpose is our research makes a difference. It shapes public policies and makes businesses, voluntary bodies and other organisations more effective. We're all trying to make a difference to society and make a better world. Now, I think one possibility to entertain is that if in this kind of community we're talking about us as NLPers and researchers as them over there, that might be interesting to question as well. Who are researchers? Is it them over there, or is it us? There's an awful lot happening that involves research, NLP developing a research identity. It's happening around the world. Lisa will talk about America in a minute. The European Association for NLP Psychotherapy has been active in research for many years. There are people in Australia and New Zealand involved in research with NLP. There's a lot of it been going on, especially in the last 5 or 6 years or so. Karen mentioned some NLP contributions, so particularly led by NLP from the UK. We've now held 3 of these international research conferences. And I was delighted at Hertfordshire in July to see what for me was a lift and progression in the quality of research being done in this field. Karen's also responsible for bringing out new publications. As she mentioned, I edit a journal called Current Research in NLP, which develops papers in an academic style. So that's particularly geared for people who maybe want to learn about how to put across their work in an academic format. Third issue is in progress, papers in the pipeline, and that will be forthcoming probably next year. Also, Joe Chill leads Acuity, another outlet where you can publish about your research. And NLP has been active in providing guidance for NLP research as well, both through the website and the report article series that we both mentioned. I think a third and really important part of this whole how NLP is developing a research identity is through people who are already practitioner researchers. And this may include some of you who I don't know, so if I don't know you're doing this, forgive me for not mentioning you. There are 3 people who I do have the privilege to know who are, I think, exemplars of NLP practitioner researchers. Richard Churches, you might know, as one of the authors of NLP for Teachers and related books. Richard is doing some fascinating research into leadership, and particularly the idea that leadership is a kind of hypnosis. And he's doing some very, very experimental research to demonstrate the extent to which leadership speech has a hypnotic effect. He's also linking NLP very strongly to recent research in the field of hypnosis and believes that is one direction to go in. 2 people working at Southampton University, Claire McDermott, who's a researcher there, and Sarah Fossell, who's an NLP practitioner, working together on a project to develop NLP interventions for chronic fatigue syndrome. This project is significant in a number of ways. There's very little available in the NHS for chronic fatigue syndrome. It kind of tends to fall off the edge. It's real-world research. Claire and Sarah are working with interventions that they're using in practice in community contexts. And the third thing that's significant about this research is that it's got funding from the National Institute for Health Research. It may not sound a big deal if you don't work in research communities, but actually getting significant recognised funding is one of the ways in which a field is recognised as being research credible. So that's really important. My third example, and I didn't tell her beforehand because I didn't want to embarrass her, but Lisa, who you'll hear from more in a moment, as well as being involved in the R&R project, Lisa's doing her own research into NLP psychotherapy. And among other things, particularly interesting because that's research that is about people's meanings and experiences of that kind of intervention. It's not about trying to do a randomized controlled trial and prove results. So it's very much exploring people's subjective experience of meanings. So the fact that in NLP we have role models already, and many more, including people who presented at the NLP conference, I think is really great evidence of the field developing this research activity. In terms of where next, excuse me, I'm running over slightly, but this is the last slide, I think. I've got really two key messages for you. In my view, if NLP wants to develop professionalism, I would argue that research is inherent to that. I don't think there's any way around that. Second message is that I would place more emphasis on the importance of research activity than on finding proof. It's very unlikely anyone is going to publish a study next year that unequivocally proves that NLP works, and you can all go out to your clients and say, here it is, here's the proof. And there's a risk sometimes that an idea of proof can become a little bit of a holy grail and develop into a never-ending quest. But what we do have already and what we can develop is research activity. And that will include the types of study that are looking for hard evidence, but it will include a whole lot more studies as well. Where next in terms of what NLP is doing? Well, in principle, I know Karen is developing or wants to take an inclusive approach towards research. So it isn't just something that happens in ivory towers or corners of universities. It's something that involves the NLP community. And the current development is exploring the potential for a large-scale research study to look at the impact of NLP in different sectors, because NLP is used in a lot of different ways. But we're particularly interested in healthcare, business, and education. Now, this project is still very much in development, but it could become a very exciting opportunity for people in the community to get involved. So two opportunities for you. One is to stay informed about that study, which will be publicised through Rapport and NLP newsletters. And the second part is to consider being part of that study when the time comes by collecting and contributing data from your own practice. That will be very, very important. Just to prove I am an academic from that other world, I've added references on in case any of you were in any doubt. That's the end of that piece. Thank you for listening, and we will take questions.